We have to talk about how governments and corporations are mismanaging all of your private data for no good reason. I discovered this tweet yesterday by an organization called the Aztec Network. And what they're working on is a privacy network for Ethereum. And in this post, they talk about how age verification doesn't need to mean surveillance. And they're referring to an age verification law in this article that was actually passed in Texas that's being challenged in the courts around, the use of pornography and requirements for people to verify their age. And they say here that ZK identities, meaning zero knowledge identities, let you prove facts like age or citizenship without revealing personal data. And so zero knowledge proofs, ZKPs, offer a path forward that protects minors and individuals' rights to privacy. And I quoted this tweet saying that, zero knowledge proofs do enable a lot of privacy protocols, but from a policy perspective, it's difficult to get governments and orgs to eat the costs. I'll go into what that means in a moment, but before I do that, for those of you who aren't familiar, zero knowledge proof is a method in cryptography that basically just allows you to prove that a given statement is true without actually revealing the underlying contents behind that statement. So for example, I could prove that I'm a citizen without actually showing you my passport or my birth certificate. I could prove that I am a certain age without telling you when exactly I was born. And I won't go into the details about the exact technical implementation and how this is done. I do have a sort of layman's explanation of how zero knowledge proofs work in cryptographic protocols in my essay, which I reference in this tweet here, the Zero Knowledge Society. So you can check that out if you want to read more. But this tweet interaction and this post that they made is relevant because there's a technology that allows you to basically preserve all of your private data and private information from governments, but also from non-governmental institutions, large corporations, tech companies, etc., that don't really need to know the exact details of that information to function. But nonetheless, they're not implementing these protocols. And the reason why is because it actually costs something. It costs something in terms of development work. It costs something in terms of implementation time. In some cases, it costs something in terms of speed. And so because there's a cost, there's a reluctance to implement these methods, these cryptographic methods, zero knowledge proofs, that would actually be able to preserve your privacy. And in the essay I mentioned, the Zero Knowledge Society, which you can find on hackingstate.substack.com, you can also find that on alexmershak.com if you want to read it. I go through and I describe a scenario where we reconfigure a lot of our public institutions, that is, non-governmental interfacing institutions, things like schools, hospitals, employers, etc., with a set of zero knowledge proofs so that your data actually belongs to you and less of your private data that's not needed to be shared with them is actually shared with them. So for example, right now, there's a lot of institutions, credit bureaus, in some cases the schools, hospitals, etc., that have your social security card, your social security number, that is, if you're an American. And this is, the government universal identification number for American citizens. And if that number gets out, it's extremely insecure. Anyone who has that number can take out loans in your name, take out credit cards in your name, do all kinds of crazy stuff with that number. And it's really just not that secure. And so it doesn't make sense to have all these organizations have it out there and have it in their file systems and just trusting them, trusting your school, trusting your employer, trusting the hospital to manage their data properly and adhere to the right security protocols and privacy practices so as that to prevent your identifying information from getting handled or misused. And you could also imagine a scenario where your employer doesn't actually need to know a lot of particular information about you either. For example, maybe they don't need to know your full name. Maybe they don't need to know your date of birth. A lot of us work in jobs where we never go into an office. We don't see our boss in person. And in that scenario, it actually doesn't make sense necessarily for them to have that information about you. But they need that information as it currently stands because they need it for tax reporting purposes. They need it to be accountable to the government. But with zero knowledge proofs, they could actually provide proof that they know the relevant information about you without actually knowing that information. That is, they could have proof that you are a real person, that you are who you say you are, that you're a singular individual, that you are a citizen of a given place, or you have permission to work in a given place without actually having that information on file. And this is extremely important for privacy protection. It prevents all kinds of things from doxes to data leaks to hacks to different kinds of data hostage situations from occurring. I can't think of the word right now, but I'm sure many of you will come up with it in the comments when you're watching this. And I lay out in this essay a strategy for how you could slowly get these organizations to start using zero-knowledge proofs in order to protect your data more securely. And I hinted it in this tweet where I say that, you have to draw a wedge. And what that basically means is that you need a set of data privacy activists, essentially, to come up with particular issues, in this case, the age verification law issue, where you can make the case that it's necessary and justified to take on the cost by institutions and maybe even by government entities in order to have your data privacy protected. And that if you did this over time, what you would eventually do is you'd have various activist groups agitating for particular issues, particular kinds of data privacy protections. And then those would become norms. And then once they become norms, they would get installed into law. This is the way that a lot of civil liberties eventually get adopted, is that it starts out with a core group of really dedicated activists who are particular about one kind of issue. This happened with, for example, the abolition of slavery, and then later on different kinds of labor movements and labor rights laws, et cetera, et cetera. The elimination of child labor, which led to then the reduction in working hours and the requirement for overtime pay, and et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of things don't start as the maximal claim that they're meant to be. We need Saturdays and Sundays off, and if you make us work more than 40 hours a week, we require overtime. No. They start off as particular wedge issues: the abolition of slavery, the abolition of child labor, certain kinds of worker protection laws for dangerous jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And then they slowly get expanded over time. And so you draw the wedge, and then it expands. And this is the kind of strategy that you need to take with data privacy protection laws, and in particular with using zero-knowledge proofs to ensure that your data is protected. This is ultimately a matter of civil liberties. And when it comes to not just organizations, but the state itself, I want to bring in an argument that I borrow from James C. Scott in his famous work, Seeing Like a State. So James C. Scott is a Yale anthropologist, and he wrote this book called Seeing Like a State, which basically describes how a fundamental function of modern nation states is that they impose legibility on their subjects. And I go into this in my essay as well. But what that means is that in order for a modern nation state to function, it has to know who's in the country. It has to know what resources are available to it, both in terms of human resources, but as well as how much money they're making, what they're doing, what kind of skills they have, etc. And it has to know where they are. And so modern nation states have all kinds of ways of basically making their citizens tractable, making their citizens countable, quantifiable, that is legible. The key word here is legible to them. And the reason for doing this is that it's in the interest of state functions and state power to have legibility over their citizens. If they don't have legibility, they actually don't have the ability to manage their people very well, and they may not know all of the potential threats and dangers and what's going on, and it's very hard for them to kind of maximize their sovereignty and their power or their rule over a given territory or a given group of people without having clear legibility into them. And so a core function of modern nation states is that they use technology to impose legibility on people. And where this comes into our discussion of zero-knowledge proofs and data privacy arguments is that if you can get non-governmental entities, that is corporations, large organizations, tech companies, etc., to start adopting zero-knowledge proofs as part of the standard practices or even part of legal requirements for interacting with your data, then you can imagine a scenario where eventually you have certain government organizations as well also having to adhere to zero-knowledge proofs, right? This is an extension of civil liberties and civil rights, where you're protecting citizens from the government itself by imposing restrictions on these institutions, on the government. And what this means is that over time, you could use zero knowledge proofs to actually reduce the legibility of the government. You could actually reduce the amount of information that states have over their citizens by imposing a set of zero knowledge proofs. Now, obviously, this is very difficult to do because organizations, as well as nation states, have an interest in knowing who you are. They have an interest in vacuuming up as much data as they possibly can about you, because that gives them control, that gives them power, that gives them the ability to manage and manipulate resources, to plan things, to function, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, it's not necessarily in your best interest, because your best interests as an individual are not always going to be, and in fact, I would argue most of the time are not going to be aligned with large nation states and large multinational institutions and organizations. Some of the time they're going to be, but a lot of the time they're not. And so the crucial idea here is that we can utilize zero knowledge proofs. You can build a privacy activism wedge around zero knowledge proofs and their implementation in institutions to sort of expand out and claim back some of your legibility, claw back legibility, not only from these large organizations, but also from the state. And if we do that, then maybe there's a chance that we could live in a data privacy future. Thank you for watching this talk. If you enjoyed this, you can check out my interview with Logan Allen, the CEO of Zorp. They are building a market for zero knowledge proofs in order to increase the functionality and spreadability of privacy protecting protocols such as zero knowledge proofs with something called NOC and the NOC chain that they're developing. It's a super interesting conversation and a great place to start if you want to learn more.